Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. My guest today is Robert Sanger. I could spend the first 5 minutes of the show just reading part of his bio, but briefly, he has been a criminal defense lawyer in Santa Barbara, California for 43 years. He is a certified criminal law specialist and has handled capital cases at the trial and post-conviction level. He has 5 capital cases pending currently. He is also professor of law and forensic science at the Santa Barbara College of Law, and he is an activist committed to abolishing the death penalty. Welcome. Welcome, Bob. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you.
So I've only got you for about 25 minutes, so I think I'm going to throw a lot of questions at you so you can provide us with your expertise. I guess the first question is the big question: why should we abolish the death penalty?
Well, my answer to that personally is because it is wrong. It's wrong to kill somebody after you capture them and lock them up. It's not a killing in self-defense. It's not a killing in war. It's pretty much a cold-blooded killing. And I think as a society we should be better than that. People generally seem to be also concerned, let us say also concerned, with the cost, with the fact that the death penalty is not administered effectively. We're dealing with life and death decisions, and they're often gotten wrong. We have a great number of wrongful convictions. We have some wrongful executions now that have been documented in recent history. And it's a very serious consequence, one that is irreversible. So I think for all those reasons, and then some, the death penalty has outlived its usefulness, so to say. It's anachronistic. It should be done away with.
I agree, but a lot of people don't. There are 31 states that still have the death penalty. California had abolished it and then reinstated it, and recently it was on the ballot, and the people of California decided that they still want the death penalty. So it's a bit mystifying to me, and I suspect even to you. But in one of the articles that you wrote, you talked about how in Illinois they had put a moratorium on executions. They did this study. They came up with, I think, about 85 items of things that needed to be changed, and California kind of could be said to have the same issues and then some. And yet, here we are, continuing the death penalty. And California even refused to put a moratorium on it. I guess my question is, who wins in this? Who is winning?
I don't think anybody wins with the death penalty. You hear that victims' families often will be opposed to the death penalty. There's a group called Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation, which is a group opposed to the death penalty, comprised of families of murder victims. You also hear from time to time that the families, including recently in a case I read about in the last day or two, family members come forward and say, do not execute, don't kill for us. The idea of closure just never happens. You know, Sister Prejean, who wrote Dead Man Walking, and has been an activist both for victims' families and eventually, as you know from the movie and the book, got involved in being a spiritual advisor to people on death row. She says, you know, there's no closure. That's really a word used by the government and by people who sort of abstractly want to justify the death penalty. There is no closure.
It's the interesting thing for me is, and again, I have to re-ask the question, but someone once, in my research, talked about the whole idea of closure, and he says if we were really worried about closure, we wouldn't just appropriate the grief of strangers to serve a policy objective. We would actively provide free long-term mental health care and other services to the families of murder victims. If we spent as much money helping survivors as we spend killing offenders, then material needs would be met for the rest of their lives. So we've got all this logic against the death penalty, and I guess going back to there's some kind of vested interest in keeping it in place. So what is the win for the people who have that vested interest? What are they getting out of this?
Well, you'd have to ask the people. I mean, there are people who lost relatives who are very adamant in favor of the death penalty because they're still dealing with their grief and their anger and other things that are associated with that.
But I'm talking about the California legislature. What's their vested interest?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's really the opposite of a vested interest. It's a fear of taking a position that might seem to be unpopular. Why get involved in the death penalty when up till recently it was pretty much a losing proposition if you were a politician? Recently, the figures have moved in the other direction, and if you figure in restitution and some other things, you can actually poll figures in favor of doing away with the death penalty. But politicians really don't want to take that on. It was somewhat unusual that the Democratic presidential platform this last year actually addressed the death penalty. Usually it's either ignored or there's a strong statement of every politician, Democrat or Republican, pretty much in favor of the death penalty.
It's quite stunning to me because it just doesn't make sense. In one of your articles, you talk about flaws in the system found in all stages. So the criminal process from police investigations, false confessions, mistaken eyewitness identifications, failure to preserve exculpatory evidence, unreliable jailhouse informants, prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective assistance, perjured testimony, tunnel vision, undertrained judges, inadequately informed jurors. All those places in the process have an opportunity to break down. Now, if somebody was going to have surgery and they named all those 10 places along the way that they couldn't guarantee that there wouldn't be a breakdown, you think they'd have surgery? But we do it. We continue to keep this in place.
Yes, and we're ill-equipped to do it, and that was the whole idea of studying the Illinois study, which found 85 problems with Illinois' law, and we had as many. One of the stunning examples I like to give is that a judge can actually be a civil judge who's never done criminal law, who gets appointed to a criminal department or gets assigned to a criminal department, never done a death penalty case, and that judge can be the judge on a death penalty case, and we've had that happen many times. Judge never done any work in capital cases, and mistakes are made. Now, I think a stunning way to look at it is to say if you were picking an umpire to preside over the World Series, or even any kind of a serious baseball game, and you said, well, this umpire is brand new. He used to be a referee in soccer, and he's watched on TV and read about it, but he's never done it before. You would be shocked,
yes,
if they put something like that in charge. And it's not to defame judges or minimize their commitment to what they do, but it's just a fact. And if you actually try cases and handle cases in the courts, and you get in front of a judge who doesn't know in detail what the rules are and what all the problems are with these kinds of cases, it can be very, very frustrating. So there are a lot of problems, and that's just one of them. But there are a lot of problems. They're documented, and the way they're documented is by the study of people who were actually not guilty, not just people who didn't get retried because time had elapsed, but where they'd actually found the actual perpetrator and realize after years in prison often that the defendant did not commit the crime and was absolutely innocent. You look back at what happened at those cases in trial, and that's where we see the problems with the forensic science, the bad forensic science, with the judges making errors, the snitch testimony, the jailhouse informant testimony, and things of that sort.
So it's very disheartening. So you try capital cases. Have you had any of your clients executed? Have any of them?
So I will knock on wood figuratively, but from the trial standpoint, I have never had a death verdict. I've had cases go to the penalty phase. I've had cases that were resolved out of it by having a verdict for something other than a capital verdict. I've had the district attorney decline to seek death after going back and forth with them and submitting applications and so on. But I've been fortunate in that regard. The 5 cases I have right now, I was appointed by the California Supreme Court to represent people who were already convicted, and we've had one reversed for an Atkins. In other words, the individual was intellectually disabled, and the judge then found that to be the case when it was sent back. That's still pending before the Supreme Court because we were appointed in 1994. We prevailed on that in 2011, and the government has appealed one more time to the Supreme Court, so that's going back to the California Supreme Court. Got another that was reversed. We're now in the trial court down in LA. We've been pending 5 years waiting for a retrial. The whole case was reversed. So I've had various experiences in all of this.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can't fault people. I mean, there are certainly lawyers that don't do things well, and ineffective assistance is an issue. But there are a lot of good-hearted lawyers who fight very hard, and their clients are still convicted. So it's a lot of work to do.
Didn't you do a paper on the whole issue of, now that you mention it, like not mentally capable, this paper about IQ and how some of the IQ results were being tweaked to make it possible for them to face execution?
Yeah, so the short version of this is that there are a couple of people, there's more than 2, but there are 2 primarily in the country who have been taking the position that if somebody is seeking relief under Atkins, and that's a case that says you cannot execute a mentally retarded or what's now called intellectually disabled individual, that they will testify for the prosecution that if the person is of color, that you have to add 5 to 15 points to their IQ score, which means that, you know, you pretty much can execute anybody of color. And it's based on flawed science, it's based on flawed everything. But if you just look at it, as a colleague of mine once said, actually a sociology professor who studied the death penalty from that standpoint, he said, so you're telling me this, you have 2 people, you have one person who's black and another person who's white, they've got exactly the same IQ, the same background, the same adaptive behavior, everything else, but the government can execute the black individual and not the white individual. And I said, yeah, that summarizes it. And this actually has been tested in that it went to the United States Supreme Court in 2014, not 20 years ago, just 2014, in the Hernandez case. The U.S. Supreme Court denied certiorari, so they refused to hear the case, even though this issue was very clearly briefed, and the man was executed in Texas 2 weeks later. And he had a 52, a 54, and a 57, and then he had a 62 on the various IQ tests that he took during the course of his life. They quote, ethnically adjusted his IQ based on racial adjustments to a 70 exactly. As they said, one test came out to a 70, and the Fifth Circuit said he could be executed. The U.S. Supreme Court did not intercede, and Mr. Hernandez was executed in April of 2014. It has not been corrected yet.
You know, again, I think most of us are pretty much unaware, because in my mind, if people are listening to this, you know, we should all be up in an uproar. And to think that they can change the IQ results so that they can execute him is mind-boggling.
It is, and as another commentator, a professor from Cornell, said, you know, you can't adjust your IQ score to get a job or to get into college, but your IQ score can be adjusted so that you can be executed. And there's a lot of science behind this, and it's not a simplistic explanation, but basically the answer is there is no racial basis to adjust IQ scores. Race, to start with, is a social construct. It's not a genetic scientific construct, but there is no genetic basis for this. It's all based on a lot of dealing with statistics in a somewhat unsophisticated fashion to come up with this conclusion. So, one thing I can tell you is that whenever I'm asked about this paper, and I was asked to give the paper at a disability rights conference last month, earlier this month in Baltimore, with a lot of lawyers and law professors, and almost all of them were equally amazed as you are. They said, I didn't know this is happening. So all I can tell you is this is why I get up in the morning, is that there are things like this that are happening, and we all have to be vigilant and fight about it.
Yeah. And do you want to say anything about what's going on in Arkansas?
Well, I think what's going on in Arkansas is awful. I haven't had a chance to check the news today, but they had 8 executions scheduled in 14 days, and people were saying, well, this is the biggest mass execution. I have to say, I'm in California. We have 749 people on death row, and right now there's about 19 who would be eligible to be executed. They've exhausted all of their remedies, and except for the fact that we have a stay based on lethal injection. And if the lethal injection stay is lifted, if that's satisfied at some point, we have 19 people that are ready to be executed. The government thinks they're ready to be executed. And the big thing, if I may just make this point, because I think it's very important, death row in California, as well as throughout the South, where most of the death states are, but there are some in the Midwest, the death rows are disproportionately populated by people of color. They are disproportionately populated by people with mental health issues, even if they're not Atkins mentally retarded, intellectually disabled, according to the standards. They have mental health issues. They are people who are all poor. There are no people with money on death row. In California, the director of corrections testified to that there are no people. Everybody on death row is poor, in the way you put it. And there are also people who were subject to abuse as children disproportionately. Basically, we are taking the marginalized people in society, and they end up on death row due to a variety of factors. The implicit bias, the fact that they may not have the best lawyers, the fact that various things happen, and we end up proving this by looking at the results. And the results are that people are of color, they're poor, they were abused as children, and they have mental health issues. So when we go to execute people, if we went to execute people in California, it would be terrible. We hear about optics these days. It's bad optics in politics. Can you imagine lining people up to execute one after another, where most of the people are of color and have these other issues? Brian Stevenson, who's a wonderful lawyer in Montgomery, Alabama, professor at Yale as well. He's a wonderful guy. But one of the things he said, he was visiting Germany, and they were talking about reinstituting the death penalty. It's a faction that was talking about that. Isn't going to happen. But one of the German scholars there said, can you imagine us reinstituting the death penalty? We have no moral claim to be allowed to kill people as a government after what happened. And yet in the United States, here we have slavery, we have Jim Crow, we've got the results of slavery. We now have a disproportionate number of people on death row who are black or of color. And it's obscene. And what Brian Stevenson said, can you imagine if Germany reinstituted the death penalty? And, oh yes, by the way, most of the people they were going to kill were
Jewish. Yes.
Oh, so these some of these mindsets, we end up in the paradigm, as you know, Thomas Kuhn and the paradigm revolution that you have to have in your head to get from one basic structure or concept to another. I mean, we've accepted the death penalty. We accept mass incarceration in this country as being a paradigm. The country has to move off of that. The rest of the world doesn't do that. The rest of the Western world doesn't do that, with the exception of maybe China and Saudi Arabia and some other places where the death penalty is employed regularly. I think we're fifth in the world in the number of people that we execute.
That's
so
unbelievable. And the word is correct. It is obscene. And, we kind of place ourselves in the position of moral superiority, when it comes to comparing ourselves with democracy, et cetera, with the rest of the world. And here we are, incarcerating the largest percentage of people, of a population incarcerated, and then killing people as a way of solving problems. And as somebody stated, there is no such thing as a foolproof death penalty, and there's no way to reverse a mistake.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we learned so much about various things. One of my passions and one of the things I teach is forensics, because there have been so many errors in forensics, and the forensic community knows that. But as you fix those things, and as you fix other things, you're never going to make it foolproof, because the Illinois Commission, which studied this at length, said we will recommend these 85 changes to Illinois' law, but we cannot guarantee that will eliminate a wrongful conviction and a wrongful execution. And it won't, because people, when they get involved in high-profile cases, high-stakes cases, they think larger than life. And I've seen this in some high-profile non-death penalty cases that I've done. People think larger than life, and when they start thinking larger than life, they stop thinking
about life.
And like a normal lawyer or a normal judge or a normal prosecutor would do. They start trying to win. It becomes a competitive enterprise instead of a search for truth, and that's why we have so many cases where exculpatory evidence was concealed and so on. I mean, there's so many flaws. Justice Stevens said, and he's in the interview that I
Yes, I saw that interview, yes.
That was remarkable for a variety of reasons. What a wonderful man. But one of the things he said, and he actually went back to what Justice White, I believe, had said earlier in Furman, this is a final kind of a penalty, and there's no reversing it. Once somebody's killed, that's it. And we've had innocent people now who have been executed. One of the most famous.
And I'm going to interrupt you here because we have like 3 or 4 minutes, but one of the things that is so compelling is that, it's only now that with DNA evidence and we're now finding that there are a lot of people who are innocent. So if we're killing people, there's always going to be some percentage of that are going to be innocent. And we're probably going to find out that it's a larger percentage than we know up until now. So if there's any chance of killing an innocent human being, it's just unfathomable, because we're killing a human being for killing a human being. But we're willing to take the chance that that person is innocent. So in our last 3 minutes, what would you like us to pay attention to, get mobilized about?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and speak with you about this, and you've obviously studied it, and you're right on point on what we need to do. I think one of the things that is very important is that we mobilize local groups and support and people to attack the death penalty where it exists in the death states. There are a lot of states that have the death penalty on the books, but they do not use it. But there are a lot of states that use it, and they use it routinely. California has been putting people on death row where they haven't been executing them, but that will change if the law doesn't change. You've got Texas that convicts and executes on a regular basis, Florida, a number of other places. You've got Arkansas now that's trying to catch up with their, quote, backlog of human beings. All of this should call out for some grassroots work. And California, we have death penalty focus, which also helps in other states, but we're primarily located here. There are other organizations to abolish the death penalty. I think people just need to be aware of that and try to support it. The Supreme Court of the United States, we had held out some hope that we might get somewhere. We all know what happened recently politically. It's still not impossible. I used to think that Justice Scalia, of all people, might have come around to our position eventually. He did on a couple of other issues. Obviously, death penalty wasn't one of them as of the time of his death. I don't know about Justice Gorsuch. I don't know about whoever might be appointed in the next, 3 or 4 years. But
I think the bottom line is first of all, is for people like you and for death penalty focus, is just to really educate us and make us aware, because we're going along in our lives not really recognizing until it hits the press, like Arkansas plans to kill this many people in this period of time. But interestingly enough, every time I get in my car, I turn on NPR, and every single day in the past week, I've heard something about this issue. So I think, again, grassroots action is what's called for. But we are at the end of our time. I so appreciate you being willing to take the time to do this, and I appreciate your commitment to this. So thank you.
Well, thank you for putting on such a fine program. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.